now is 7:02 or 3 almost. So I think we will get started. As you know, I think there'll be more people joining us from different locations around the world. But that's fine then. So good evening, everyone, and good morning from people who joining us from North America. So in Asia, I think it will be in the evening, and also in Europe would be sometimes in the afternoon, I guess. Thank you very much, everyone, for your interest in our event. This is the event called the Transformative Humanities Series, which is the continuing kind of academic event organized by Faculty of Humanities, Chiang Mai Universities. In this series, we invite academics, scholars, practitioners, whose works engage in a different aspect of humanistic research to share their ideas and their works. And we hope that this platform will inspire kind of new creative ideas and other intellectual ideas, both from within or outside of academia, particularly on the role of relationship humanities in today and the near futures too. And our first sessions, we are joined by Dr. Casper Brunjensen, if I pronounce Casper's name correctly. This is my first time meeting him virtually on the Zoom application as well. Actually, Casper and Dr. Chakrit known each other for a while, I think. Dr. Chakrit has introduced him to me, and very lucky to have him here as our first session. So Dr. Chakrit will also join us he's from Bangkok, Thailand, about 7 hours drive from Chiang Mai. Dr. Chakrit will help, taking the kind of role as a, asking question for Casper at the end of his presentation. So since we discussed with Casper, and I think Casper has a lot to say today, so I'm just going to not waste any more time as a host at Chiang Mai University. So I'm just going to give this space to Casper to begin introducing his presentations. And then, he can carry on from that. Okay, Casper, it's yours.
Okay, well, can you hear me, first of all?
Yep.
It sounds okay. Okay, and I apologize to everybody if I fall out once in a while. I'm in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. The connection is not always perfect, but we try. So, so thank you very much for the invitation and the kind introduction. It's quite an honor to be invited to speak at a Transformative Humanities series, and maybe one of the first lectures even. So I do hope that I have something relevant and interesting to say. And thanks to all the local people from Thailand, and I can see also some foreign names, including people I know from Denmark, among others. So, well, thank you for showing up in these pretty crazy times. So I called the talk for today, Learning to Live with a New Earth, Cosmo-Ecology and the Connectivity of Disciplines. It's clearly a very long and difficult title. And if we take the first part of it, just learning to live with a new Earth, it's obviously also a title that I can't live up to. I mean, I don't know how we're supposed to be living with a new Earth, because I think none of us know how we're supposed to be living with a new Earth, and we're not indeed sure what a new Earth is. But it does name something that's going on relating to climate change, or as it's called, Anthropocene, or biodiversity extinction, and many problems having to do with environments that we are gradually becoming more and more attentive to, and for good reason worried about. So I'm naming this Learning to Live with a New Earth, not because I have an answer to that, because it's not for me to have an answer to that, but together what's going on, what might be done about this increasingly complicated situation we find ourselves in. And there is called by Pasud and his colleagues. The vantage point for thinking about that I'm going to adopt today is via the question, of disciplinary knowledges and the connectivity of disciplines. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of my slightly complicated comment on a little bit to start. So it says, this lecture will examine alternatives to the idea that academic disciplines are defined by their respective and fundamentally different orientation to either natural worlds, as the natural sciences, or cultural worlds, as the cultural or social sciences. Instead of having this kind of dichotomy of two fundamentally different things, this landscape and it follows from that, I say in the abstract and repeat here, that instead of being defined by having fundamentally different aims and methods, this landscape is characterized by a lot of variation within each of the disciplinary practices, whether we're talking about literature or ecology, anthropology, or geomorphology. Characterized by variation within each practice, but also characterized by possibilities for making new kinds of connections that I call and this image of a landscape of partially connected practices is really quite fundamentally different from, let's say, one or two other ones that are more dominant or have been more popular, we might say. The one is, as I'll talk about shortly, the old idea of two cultures, one a culture of scientists and the other a culture of humanities scholars who are doing fundamentally different things and can't comprehend each other, and in fact also often mutually dislike each other, in part because they can't understand each other. But it is also very different from another idea of interdisciplinarity, where knowledges would be integrated by becoming more and more of the same kind. And usually when you hear of systematization, systems of knowledge, this will pop up. It was famous years ago with E.O. Wilson's Resilience or Consilience books, where the idea is that the humanities and the social sciences are sort of primitive real sciences, but they could come better if they learn to be more like the real sciences. This is just because they really know the objective state of affairs of the world. But nowadays, geneticists are also high on the agenda, and people that can do stuff with nano and so on. But in all of this, we get with hierarchy of images where all these things humanities people are doing are at the bottom and the real stuff is at the top. So if us who are doing humanities or social science could learn like the scientists, everybody would be happier. It's also not that. It is instead of the idea of integrating knowledge in that sense in a system or a framework with a hierarchy, it is, as I say in the abstract, a question of understanding a landscape of differences that produce, and I use the words of Michel Serres, to whom I will return a little bit later. And so rather than specified by different aims and methods, this landscape of knowledge is characterized by variations within each practice and by possibilities for creating sophisticated conjunctions across practices. And this is an image that's radically different, both from the notion that the two cultures are really fundamentally different, but also from the idea you'd have a hierarchy of knowledges and epistemologies, typically with natural science on top and humanities at the bottom. So I hope now, I hope at least some of that came through the second round. And so with an image from Michel Serres, I refer to that in the abstract as less a conjuncture to control than an adventure to be had together. And this Michel Serres, who I'll return to, he talks of the landscape of knowledge. Here, it's of course several images. It's images of what is called the Northwest Passage, that used to be an extremely challenging place to travel through because of all the ice flows here. But if you could travel through it, you'd be able to go across from Russia, across to Canada, or behind the North Pole, and save an enormous amount of travel time, and you'd be able to save money and so on. There's all travel history of the North Passage. But the point is, traveling this juncture here is never a matter of control. It's a matter of navigating in a system that is fundamentally changes all the time with ice. And you can't know exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be an adventure to be had together. Now, the reason I put these images up here today is that one of the reasons why we want to talk about transformative humanities today is not least, at least as far as I'm concerned, because of climate change, radically changing weather, the Anthropocene, and similar topics. And one of the consequences of those changes is that, in fact, the Northwest Passage, which used to be so extremely difficult to navigate, is now more or less free of ice. The adventure to be had is, in fact, becoming much more easy to travel. But I don't think that's the same is the case for our situation with respect to our different knowledges. I think that, in fact, climate change and the rapid changes all around us, it doesn't have to be melting ice, but it can be, creates not a collapse in the ecology of knowledges where everything becomes the same, but rather new configurations and new patterns, as you can see in the ice here, where we will have to learn stuff together in a new way. And so this is in forms of knowledge organization emerge through mutual difficult relations, which can, among other things, make researchers attentive to their own blind spots, their own limitations of perspectives, and be enriched by each other in new ways. And I call this today and in other situations, the possibility of developing a cosmo-ecological approach. And I call it cosmo-ecological because the aim is to keep what we can call the ontological composition open, and where we can advance conceptually in effective terms and in political repertoires by working across our differences rather than trying to integrate them. And I think that in the context of accelerating climate change, this idea of cosmo-ecology has implications that definitely affect academic disciplines, but also go far beyond them. And this is what is named at the title also, at issues the necessity to profoundly rethink how it is possible to live with a new Earth, and we don't know what that Earth actually is. Okay, so after that dramatic beginning here, and I'm presuming you can still hear me until you say something else. I'm going to go back to clarify, talk a little bit about what it is we're getting away from, because I think this is in fact an image that I don't know how it is in Thailand, but in many countries is still with us today. And this is the image of C.P. Snow's 1959 commercial depiction of two truly different cultures, natural science and humanities, populated by two kinds of people, natural scientists and what he calls then literary intellectuals, which means also that people like Jack Critt and myself, social scientists in some sense, don't exist. We're in the gap between the two. But Snow's original depiction was one in which natural scientists can't understand why literary intellectuals keep babbling on about Shakespeare forever. What's the point? How does it advance the way we're living in the modern world? While Shakespeareans and those who love Milton or who loves classical Chinese literature or Thai literature find or providing the knowledge for new technologies dull and limited compared with the rich universes they inhabit when they deal with literary works. So this image of a state of mutual hostility and incomprehension, and at least from my experience with interdisciplinary collaborations, the very idea of interdisciplinary collaboration suggests that people do want to collaborate, but the underlying idea to culture in some sense, and they have quite different orientations to the world they inhabit, still seems to me to be very often with us and create, let's say, what is the point of doing what you, why is it worth anything? Why should it be funded, as I know is a problem for many humanities scholars, when it's useless, and so on and so forth, right? We know these kinds of, I think this is in Thailand and it is everywhere else. So that the ideology of two cultures and their way of evaluation is definitely still with us today. So we want to problematize this figure here. And I copied this from a book by Barbara Herrnstein-Smith called Scandalous Knowledge. And she's in fact a literary scholar with a great many interdisciplinary interests. And I hope you can, if you squint your eyes a bit, you can see some what is on it. I mean, it's not so important, you can follow all of it. But in her book, Scandalous Knowledge, she's presenting this figure as a sort of schematic representation of the two cultures. And she begins by arguing that if we go with these presentations here, they're not altogether mad, crazy, or insulting. So if you glance down at the two columns here, the left on your screen will be natural science, and the right on your screen will be humanities. Many of the items and ways of classifying will appear plausible. On the one hand, we have natural sciences observing things, they're studying material objects, natural phenomena. They do that carefully. They are value neutral, describing stuff. Their emphasis is on experimentation and data collection, leading to testing of hypotheses, and so on and so forth. We would not want to say this is completely crazy. It matches more or less what we think natural scientists are doing. Conversely, on the other side, what we as humanities scholars or social sciences are doing, we are studying intentional, meaningful action, creations, texts, and artifacts, carefully examining them, interpreting, evaluating, and explicating them. We might be normative and critical, and we have various methods. It's not data in a natural science. For example, talk with people, do text analysis, archival research. And why would we do that? To seek understanding, insight, or appreciation, do commentaries and reconstructions, and so forth, okay? When you look at this schematic representation, so the idea Herrnstein-Smith is presenting here is that they should appear more or less matched with each other. That is, they should reflect differences and perhaps trade-offs, but not sort of fundamental rivalries. On one hand, and understanding on the other. You have the simplicity and clarity of natural science on the other, on one hand. And if you can hear me, because it says unstable again, you have richness and subtlety on the other, valued by humanists. Presumably, all of these are good things, values and virtues, worthy aims and proper methods. So that's great as far as it goes. However, and here's where the two cultures and therefore the transformation of humanities begin to set in. If you stop and think a little bit longer over this schematic representation, you'll start to notice some additional things that indicate that what we in reality are dealing with in our work is more complicated. There's a certain instability in the terms, and it shows, for example, in the fact that many scientists and humanities scholars are going to say that, well, it's true, maybe true what you're saying about the other side, but we are also doing that. For example, doesn't science produce understanding and insight? Is it just cold knowledge and prediction and control? Probably not. Reversely, doesn't social scientists or humanities scholars search for things that are at the bottom of the other list, intellectually valuable? Aren't they interested in careful observations? Don't they seek knowledge and so on? Aren't they in fact also looking for regularities, if not necessarily laws, in the corpus of texts they study? In other words, you can't quite so clearly say which one belongs to which. Now, that step, in fact, the phenomena we study, where do they belong? Because if you start thinking about something like, now we're talking about literary scholars here, among others, language. Language would have to belong to the right side in that it is literary production. It has to do with purposive action, intention, understanding, appreciation, and so on. But yet language is also a natural object. It can be measured. It has pitch and range and sequence. You can do big data sets as we do nowadays. Language doesn't belong to one or the other. What about culture? Culture can be definitely studied by the cultural sciences, but natural sciences also want to study culture. Or what about science, in fact? Now I'm from science and technology studies. Is science studied scientifically with scientific methods? Well, it can be, but a lot of the most interesting things said about science these days is said by historians and anthropology. Breakdown from both sides of two cultures here. From both sides, things start to switch around and everything seems to be in both places at once. And so we will eventually end with something like this, which is not from Barbara Herrnstein-Smith's book, but rather from the famous anthropologist Marilyn Strathern's book, A Fractal Image of Knowledges. What we see with the fractal image of knowledges is, on the one hand, the general distinction between humanists and scientists is not going to do much work for us. Enlightenment and superstition, good knowledge and bad knowledge, useful and not useful. Because once you start zooming in, each of the distinction on each of the halves of the scheme can be found on both sides. So this is the replication here of the Cantor's dust, where you keep sort of splitting the line in smaller and smaller halves and smaller and smaller halves. And the same differences keep replicating. And it's, of course, in itself extremely striking that Cantor's dust is used in a book called Partial Connection to understand culture and society by one of the most famous British anthropologists, Marilyn Strathern, whereas it is, in fact, an image that comes from chaos and complexity theory in mathematics, where no doubt the mathematicians would be surprised to see the use Cantor's dust is doing in anthropology. So what we get here is a recurrent duplication within many of our disciplines of many of the divisions that we had back here. And so, for example, if we talk anthropology, you'll not only does this scheme here not make any sense in general, but you'll have within anthropology both biological anthropology, which belongs to the left side, and cultural anthropology, which belongs to the right side. but anthropology is presumably humanities or social science discipline. So where are we with the two cultures? We are everywhere or nowhere. Or indeed, if we think about psychology, we have clinical psychology with Freud, but we have experimental psychology with the cognitivists. It's both sides, just different parts of the discipline. Or indeed, since we're talking about literature also, we have on the one hand sort of naturalist descriptions, philological scholarship, and historical archival stuff, which more or less belongs to the natural sciences side. And then you have interpretive criticism and theory on the other, which clearly does not belong on that side. So in each case, fractal knowledge is here. And so the question that's going to continue to hold my interest for the rest of this talk here is what to do about that situation. And obviously there are many, many different things that can be done with that situation. So I'm going to focus on something specific, and I'm going to also the scene in a little bit of detail so you can see where I'm coming from, speed up a little bit and give some broader pictures here. And so my starting point here will be French, Michel Serres, and Bruno Latour. And I'm going to start with Bruno Latour, who many of you may have heard of by now. I think he's old. We've never been modern translated into English in '92, so it's almost 30 years old now. 20 years old, 30 years old. Is still, if more well-known, it's not less relevant for all of that. And what we get in We've Never Been Modern is a diagnosis of Americans. It's never been quite sure how well it fit, say, Peruvian, Thai, or Japanese societies. But the idea of a modern constitution of knowledge and practice premised on different domains, again, like in Barbara Herrnstein-Smith's schemata here, again, the same, nature and society. And because Latour's religious, he has a third one called religion, but he wrote separately about that, and I won't talk about it today. And again, he diagnoses the modern constitution as premised on these different domains, each with its own elements, each with its own rules and laws. And it follows in his diagnosis then that this is not going to work. And back in '92, I think, in fact, he started out with something about the collapsing ozone layer as showing why it won't work. Because he's saying you go to a section in the newspaper, you open it up, you expect to find a social discussion about a business. 3 lines in, you have genetics, you have geology, you have something else. Everything is mixed up. It's not social and political. It's full of other things. Then you go to a natural, the science section, and you can't read 2 lines without hearing discussions about competitions between nations, backstabbing, cheating, ideologies, bias. All the social stuff comes swarming into the scientific sections. There is no different domains, or are no different domains with their own elements. It won't work. And his solution will be, as I said at the bottom of this slide, an amodern alternative premised not on separation between these elements, but on hybridity. But he does also pause to say, give 3 versions of things that won't work. And I'll just touch them very quickly. They are on the slide here. This is his 3 discussion partners in the book. Naturalization. It means making everything conform to natural laws. It means making everything fit with the left side of the previous slide. And it means providing a kind of explanation that says, you may think that this is a cultural issue, but actually it's genetics or neurons. It's not culture. It's hardwired into your bodies. That's naturalization, right? So the infamous gay gene, for example, right? That's naturalization gone crazy. Conversely, in the social sciences, you might have social construction, which does the same, Latour says, just in the other direction. You may think that all of these are the reasons why something happened, but actually actually it's your culture that did that. Or maybe actually it's capitalism. All these things that are going on are then pertaining to a production. And for good measure, because Jacques Derrida was very strong in France at the time, he also has a separate thing on deconstruction, which you may be familiar with still in Chiang Mai 30 years later, Jacques Derrida and deconstruction. You may think that set is a phenomenon, but actually, if you go closer and closer to it, it'll turn out to be an unstable amalgam of elements that never reach a firm point, but will have a sort of continuous play of difference, which means that you'll never be able to really pin it down. Disappointed criticism, if that was fair or not. But nevertheless, he is taking the pains to differentiate himself, not just from genetic determinism, social determinism, but also deconstruction as a mode of thought that allows you to point at the hybridity in a certain sense, but only to stop by saying, we can't go any further than recognizing its instability. So this is what he wants to get away from. And in fact, his way of getting away from that is by way of a very distinctive Michel Serres, who was in part his mentor, in part a philosopher of mathematics and of language and of communication and of much else, and with a previous career also as a sailor, from which he got the image, no doubt, of the Northwest Passage. So Michel Serres has been a little bit forgotten, probably in part because it's quite difficult to slot into easy disciplines because he's all over the place. But he was one of Latour's major influences, and I think he's highly relevant for rethinking transformation. And I'm just going to show a couple of his book titles and give you a few pointers, because he has written like 50 books. He passed away, I think, last year, and there's no way of doing justice to all his ideas and analysis. But his fundamental claim, which is itself, it has to be said, a provocative and in a sense reductive claim that, let's say, places him in a good position to say what he wants to say, is that conventional forms of critique in the humanities operate by establishing what he calls a meta-language. Latour will repeat this in We've Never Been Modern and other texts. A meta-language consists of a much smaller set of terms than the text itself. And so classical examples would be ideology. Why is this going on within a given corpus? This can be explained by the ideology of the bourgeois writer of the text. Or in Freudian terms, there was a Freud, right? This can be explained with reference to Freudian or Lacanian understandings of the unconscious, which gives us a wedge by getting into the text, but not just one text, but many texts, because you'll be able to find the same operations of ideology or the varied sort of articulations of the unconscious in an enormously diverse corpus once you have that method of inquiry. So the meta-language simplifies the text by reducing their internal multiplicity to an external simplicity, the meta-language, which has very little to operate with. In anthropology, it would be neoliberalism. All kinds of stuff is going on, and then at the end of the day, and why? Well, neoliberalism or colonialism. And so Serres will say that explanatory power, and Latour also copies this literally, means normally the capacity to replace the many words of the text with a few of the meta-language. We understand this because we know that was ideology in the same way as over here. But he's not happy with this. He is suggesting that explanations that aim to replace and simplify the text, in fact, dominate. And in fact, that expectation itself means that it becomes very difficult for a text to exceed the expectation of what the interpreter puts into it. Like in organizational science, for some years, it was known as garbage in, garbage out. Like if you know it's going to be neoliberalism in advance in anthropology, you're going to find neoliberalism. If you know it's going to be the unconscious, what would possibly convince you it's not the unconscious? And so this kind of determination makes Sayers describe critics as spies, in fact, police spies, looking over the shoulder of someone with something to hide. So you're looking over the shoulder of the text and the text has something to hide, but you're going to unveil it as in the imager. You're going to pull the curtain out to find out what is really going on. And then the critical maneuver is showing that, and as it is, rendering the text naked or bare, turning the textual analysis for the humanities into a succession of policemen, spies, and felons, as he said. He's not mincing words. Now, what is the alternative to that then? As far as Sayers is concerned, and I'm just putting it out here, and I recommend that you take a, I think he reads like anything incomparable. You like him or hate him, he's pretty incomparable. So it's interesting in its own right. So for example, he will read in The Birth of the Fish, the mid-title there, the old Roman Lucrece cosmological poem as not a cosmological poem that is opposed to the real physics of today, but in fact, he will read it as a precursor of actual chaos theory. So you see the refusal of the two cultures directly at work. Lucrece already understood, he didn't have all the laboratories, but he already understood chaos theory. Of course, he couldn't use chaos theory words and equations, but he had it done in that poem in a way that matches and articulates what chaos theory is about, that is not inferior to what we get from science today, Sayers will say. Lucrece did chaos, in other words. Aesop and La Fontaine did not simply tell us kids' fables. He will say, and this he does in The Parasite, a sophisticated theory of information and communication that matches and in some sense exceeds the best formal theories of information and communication we have today. They're not behind us and they're not below us in an epistemological hierarchy. They are with us today and they're able to convey something crucial about information and communication that communication theorists still don't know how to do in fables. And correlatively, Bruno Latour will write about, in my opinion, also the great American novelist Richard Powers, that he offers resources for giving our own empirical descriptions, the kind of grasp of unreality that we can understand conceptually through the work of the pragmatists William James and Alfred North Whitehead. So in other words, Powers are not just telling funny or great or interesting stories. Now I put his new story in because it's about climate change and climate action, the Ore story, and it's a beautiful book, totally worth reading. Like I read it like candy myself. But Latour is saying you don't have to, you can read it like that, but he's also giving us resources for coming to terms to things that we would otherwise. He's not inferior from James or Whitehead, other tour series. He's in a different place and he gives us narrative resources for fleshing out as he's writing about. It's not a matter of criticizing or finding the underlying motives or logics. It's a matter of drawing out their absolute distinctiveness and contemporaneity where we are today and the problems we face. So what we get from all of this, I have just put on more titles. I'm not going to spend much time talking about those, just because I think the covers are quite distinctive and beautiful, and you can see what they look like. What we get from all of this in both Serres and Latour is a refusal to situate fiction and also literature and literary scholarship than as sort of fun whipped cream, a little bit of dessert on top of the real hard labor of science, or in a sort of differential and oppositional relation, contrast to science, but rather as complementary domains that feed into each other. As, again, the image back here, as this kind of landscape, where I put this into words as heterogeneous knowledge forms, in which science is full of myth and myth is full of science, and the temporalities are not obvious. Because if Lucrete wrote chaos theory 2000 years before chaos theory, he was ahead of us, not behind us. Reading where he shows the identity or similarity, in a sense, between the Challenger rocket that was sent into space, I think in '84, with scientists, of course, astronauts, but also the first school teacher in space. And the rocket exploded and they all burned to death. It was a terrible, terrible situation. And Serres is analyzing that as analogous, in some sense, to the old Roman rituals where they sacrificed victims to their god. And it sounds crazy in this schematic form, but this is the kind of movement that's going on. The mythic dimension of science that will put the first teacher into space, and is not entirely detached from our archaic past, where people would do something altogether different and violate and sacrifice people to the altar of something that was not science but God's. So anyway, I can't get into this. Literature, science, and philosophy sort of says it all in the English translation subtitle here. These kinds of combinatorial readings that totally transform humanities, or what it is you're capable of imagining yourself to be doing while you're engaging in them. Now, so if we then step out from the little French intermezzo here with Latour, where are we now? I think overarching or coherent logic is not going to work whatsoever. There's not going to be a system, and there's not going to be a epistemological hierarchy. But on the other hand, the collapse from both sides, or from all the sides, because everybody is doing both nature and culture, everybody is pursuing lots of different things at the same time, also means that this kind of, I would call it, banal interdisciplinarity that we've been used to thinking about, where each discipline or subdiscipline, each does their little bit, but nobody bothers the others, because I'm not going to harass you, Pasut, because you're the expert in what you're doing, and I'm the expert in what I'm doing, so you're not going to harass me. So we both provide our little piece of the puzzle, and then we conveniently forget that the puzzle doesn't add up to anything, because actually they're two different puzzles. Yeah, that's not going to work. Call it work with Pastor that fits with others. Instead, each constructs a whole image of the whole world and its relations within it, and they're not going to map, and they're not going to match. So they're not going to agree in a sort of interdisciplinary puzzle. agree in the same way as a landscape doesn't agree. And it's not a matter of agreeing by traveling between one place or another. An adventure to be had, not a matter of an agreement to reach. And this is what I talk about here and elsewhere as sophisticated conjunctions. Because it's not a matter of figuring out the minimal we can agree on, but it's a matter of figuring out the maximal of our differences so we can work through them in what I call at the bottom here, mutual constructive complication, which would mean that Jakrit would force me to recognize my blind spots and what I really haven't been able to do with where I come from. Whereas conversely, I'll force Pasud or some of you others to do that because you truly haven't thought through your own presumptions. And the solution will not be that we agree. The solution will that we'll be differently enriched by what we've gotten out of it from each other. And now I think I have like to keep time more or less. I have 10 or 15 minutes, and I'll try to stick with that. But that'll be fine. I'm just going to give. I'm going to just put that image that I have tried to serve up very quickly. Climate change and some of the names we have for that. And here I'm a little bit out of context because I don't know how these topics are discussed precisely in Thai, whether you use the same terms, whether they are common or whether they're not common, or how they've been translated. So there's a translation labor here, but nevertheless, at least in the English language, the Anthropocene has gained a lot of traction over the last 10 years. And this was a term that has been the possible human strong and definite imprint. So it's now possible to say we're not in the Holocene, which was a particular kind of geological epoch, but the Anthropocene. And this is that discussion, whether that's going on or not, is pursued originally in geology. It's now pursued in earth system science, socio-ecology. It's pursued also outside of geology because it has been brought in to think about topics like planetary boundaries, whether we are breaching planetary boundaries, so we can't have kids anymore, they're all going to die in 3 generations or not. Big things like that. So the Anthropocene began entering social sciences and the humanities, including environmental humanities. And immediately the term was challenged quite violently. For the ideas, among other things, there are many discussions within this, but among other things, the idea that the Anthropocene suggests that it's humanity that's responsible for climate destruction. Humanity in general. For example, it's not, some parents are not as responsible as my grandparents from a Danish suburb, and they are not as responsible as big capitalists from Manchester who had the coal mills or whatever. I mean, that it's differentiated, and it's differentiated according to not to race in a derived manner to race, but certainly to colonialism and capitalism. Right? Hence, Anthropocene is misleading. It sort of deflects from the real issues, which are global inequality and violent domination over 300 years. And we must talk about other things. We must talk about Capitalocene, which names that it's not capitalism that's the problem. It's not humanity. We must talk about Plantation scene, which is a particular, maybe American version of it. Not only American, could also be Indonesian, I guess. But the idea colonial powers came over, set up plantations, extracted everything, and took it back home. Then others will say, and it's Donna Haraway, if you recognize her crazy language, we must talk about the Cthulhu scene because everything is hybrid and mingled. Or Isabel Stengers will say, we must talk about Gaia, re-evoking the old James Lovelock hypothesis. So we have a whole set of alternatives to the Anthropocene on on the other hand. And it would seem then that we have something like the two cultures once again, Anthropocene and the natural scientists, and then a sort of human sciences who can never agree on anything, as always. And that's interesting, but I don't think this is entirely the case for reasons similar to the reasons that the old two culture scheme that I showed before is breaking down. And so that shows in the following ways, which I'll spend 3 minutes on. For one thing, you see that natural scientists are now becoming more and more interested in reading social sciences and environmental humanities scholars. Why are they interested in that? Well, the first case that I saw was by a friend of mine and a great anthropologist of science called Heather Swanson, who analyzed a discussion in the pages of Nature about when should the Anthropocene begin. So the natural scientists are discussing this topic, and some are saying, well, when did humanity really begin making a geological agriculture in Mesopotamia 13 Anthropocene since agriculture started? Some say. Others say, no. It's with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's with Liverpool and the coal mines and other things in the 1840s. No. Of the nuclear bomb. And no others will say it's with the invasion of the Americas and the destruction of biodiversity and the local people there in a genocide, which was so significant that it can be measured today atmospherically as a dip in the CO2 at the time, because everybody died, so they couldn't grow any crops. And so, as you can hear, the discussion about when the Anthropocene starts is not a natural science one. It has to do immediately with environmental history, the history of colonialism, the history of botanism, botany in different parts of the world, and the consequences that the scientists are in fact engaging, not in a loose interdisciplinary manner with some funny ideas from humanities and social sciences, but in a deep idea with the specific analysis they're making of how things changed in Mesoamerica after Columbus traveled over there, which they're using to correlate things they measure in the atmosphere. Environmental history is correlated with stratigraphic measures in the atmosphere. That's a sophisticated conjunction of knowledge drawing mutually on extremely diverse data sets without any hierarchy in order to solve a problem that's quite serious. And one of the reasons it's really serious is because they, as the scientists recognize, there are political stakes to the choice of the date for where the Anthropocene starts. Because if you say it starts 13,000 years ago, of course you can't hold anybody now responsible because everybody has done agriculture for a long time. But if you say it starts with the Industrial Revolution, it's evident that capitalism is responsible. So the establishment of the natural scientific claims is recognized by the natural sciences to be directly implicated with the knowledge, political and humanities, environmental conjunctions and new alliances. More briefly and more simply, Earth system scientists these days will say, we know that planetary boundaries are threatened, but we don't know what to do about it because nobody has taught us how to tell stories that can activate the imaginations of people so they can see and feel for themselves what is at stake. We don't know how to do that. We need people to narrate. We need people to imagine and speculate about what might happen. To get people involved in this, the world is collapsing around us. We are unable to convince anybody. What should we do? So these situations, these and many other situations, were new critical situations, critical in the sense of things are breaking down, it's a critical condition. in fact calls for alternatives to critique as showing that it doesn't work in this way. It's really the ideologies that are speaking. It's the unconscious. Critical situations calling for mutual constructive labor of sophisticated on extremely diverse repertoires. That's what I think transformative and environmental humanities is about. I'm just gonna, I was going to mention some stuff my good friend Arturo Morita from Osaka University and I have been doing in deltas around here. He works in Chao Phraya, I work on Mekong, and what it means to talk cosmo-ecologically about those issues. But I'm running out of time, so I won't do that. But I will mention just a special issue that, and this is to advertise basically, a special issue that I edited of a journal that me and friends in Osaka are running called Nature Culture, and it's open access, so it's there's anything can be accessed. And I did an issue last year with a PhD student, now graduated PhD student called Ashley Kemiksic. She's going to speak later in this series, in fact, I believe, called Experiments in Thinking Worlds. And if you notice the guiding metaphor for all I've been saying, going back 100 times to this kind of ice landscape where you jump from one to the other, an adventure to be had. These are all ways of talking about what we call the experiments in thinking across world. Experiments mean an adventure to be had. Thinking across worlds means they can be connected. You can travel, but it's not necessarily that easy. That's why it's an adventure to be had. It's also an adventure to be had because you don't exactly know what comes out, but you expect it might be worthwhile, enriching, and important. So the reason why I mentioned this issue here is because the worlds across we were thinking were anthropological worlds and science fiction worlds, which means that all the contributions there are directly speaking to anthropological or at least social science concerns via science fiction. So it exemplifies in a way what it is I'm talking about here. So we would have the Chicago anthropologist Michael Fish analyzing or creating a new version of Thomas Hobbes' Natural Contract by reading Adrian Tchaikovsky's crazy multi-species science fiction with intelligent spiders, octopuses, and humans, among others. We would have speak later in this series also on the great title, How to Make a Time Machine, arguing that social science and humanities scholarship might learn what diplomacy in a climate-challenged world could mean by reading the weird science fiction of China Miéville. And I have myself indulged in something similar, trying to understand what climate breakdown means and what it could entail by reading it through Paolo Bacigalupi's science fiction, in fact, taking place in Thailand, but I don't know if it's famous in Thailand, but it should be, called The Wind-Up Girl, where you have a Thailand that's flooded with refugees from Malaysia, where there's been a genocide. It's flooded with so-called new people, which are sort of semi robots built in Japan, of course, doing hard work of fighting wars and doing sex labor, where you have extractive capitalists from the US, and everything is going down in Thailand. Right? So I'm taking that as a sort of an image of something that might be happening if we don't find out how to make it not happen. That is by creating a speculative image that allows us to see where we might be headed and where we might not want to head, so that it induces a different kind of speculation for creating other kinds of trajectory. Be 15, 20, or 100 years from now. And I think that's it. This is the last slide anyway. And now I deleted my own video here, so I have absolutely no idea if you could see. You couldn't see me. If you could hear me, the response is 0. I hope something has gone through anyway. but so to attempt to attempt a summary under these kind of affect deprived conditions, I would just do it under these three quick headings here. Cosmo-Ecology, which I skimmed quite quickly over, as a matter of learning together to live and feel and think and experience and be affected about the kinds of breakdowns and radical transformations that are happening around us. Not in order to try to regain a fictive modern sense of control over the situation. We're not going to get that. But because we must sort of take it up as a challenge, as an adventure to be had again together in order to figure out where we're going. Second, the sort of more negative point here is, the point is not, it's stated negative, but I don't mean it negative, that the modern critical dictionaries that we have mainly been learning from, for good reasons, Marx, Durkheim, Bourdieu, maybe even Foucault, all the French, all the Germans, they were great in many ways for many things, but we are not certain any longer that they're capable of delivering what we need, because we are in a situation none of them could imagine. This kind of rampant, out of control climate change, so many things are going on. I mean, even who would be our theorist for COVID? Does the theorist exist? I don't think it's any of the modern critical dictionaries have delivered the goods we would need for that, which just proves again, given this kind of hybridization, the surprises, the emergencies, those dictionaries and terminologies are in serious need of update and revision. Nobody have them. We need to create them together. And Cosmo-Ecology names that again. The need to make new dictionaries, vocabularies, and speculative trajectories together so that we collectively can make sense of all the changes around us. So that, again, collectively, we can try to imagine alternatives to where we might be headed. And so that we can collectively, again, speculate and experiment with pathways into less destructive and better futures, which I think many of us would agree for different reasons that we, in fact, do need very much so. So for me, I think this is, as I started out saying, I cannot deliver on how to live with the new Earth, but I can sort of set out what I think are the stakes, and I think these are the stakes, and I think they're big ones. And for me, anyway, that's why I'm here also, and that's why I said yes happily to join, because I think they are really, we must figuring out what to do about them. So I'm gonna stop, put my video back on, and hope you heard something.
So I think I will take the role, even though I'm not the host, but I'll take the role of like moving toward the other section, which is well, I will have few probably response and questions to Casper, and also I think we would be happy to have also questions and comments from our colleagues here who joined the webinar. So my first response to a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation by Casper is that this will be about the landscape of knowledge. Okay. So when we talk about knowledge or disciplinary field, okay, and Casper has mentioned to us that of course we sort of realize that there are hierarchical relations among different disciplinary fields. For example, we consider something science, which is a lot of people perceive it as something like very solid and on the top of the priority, not only in terms of academic but also in terms of policy making and other regime as well. So on one hand, there is a hierarchical relation among different disciplinary fields. But on the other hand, not in terms of vertical relation, but also in terms of hierarchical, or in terms of horizontal relations. For example, now we engage with different scholars from different fields. And in our academic practice, we borrow different ideas, different method from other field as well. So even though we borrow different kind of thinking and methodology from other field, we brought it into our own field, and we use it within our own field. So in that sense, it is not a truly how can I say, making dialogue, but actually import something into our own way of perceiving the world. So to use John Law's term, it is becoming another one world, because we move it into our own world. We don't use it as it is used by other people. So what I'm saying here is that on both hands there is a hierarchical relation and horizontal unequal relation among different fields, right? So discipline itself is can be considered as knowledge boundary making. So we love to make boundary. We would like to demarcate, and that is the practice of so-called modern constitution. So when we perceive the world, we perceive from our own epistemological comfort, So in order to overcome this kind of limitation, I think that there is also another field that we can be considered. And I think we have learned about this for a long time, but probably we haven't taken serious consideration about it enough, which is the field work. Okay, so on one hand we have knowledge field, and on the other hand we talk about field work as alternative to knowledge field. But when we talk about field work here, I'm anthropologist, coming from people who are conducting field work. Field work can be considered something different from our previous conception of it. So we're not talking about field work as an activity to record or to collect the information about the others, but also the idea of field work need to be redefined as something like we're going out and encounter with something that surround us, or being at least sensitive to the things that perform around us, or even even something that we don't know, we can also speculate. That is also one Earth. This is oops, I think my internet is also unstable. So I think if we are going to learn to live with the new Earth, is it possible that instead of starting from the school, just like what we are now, when when everyone start to grow up, we go to school and we learn about knowledge field first, and then we apply our knowledge field into the world. So that is the way it is. But then on the other hand, on the reverse side, if we start the new way of learning about the world we live in, or even the new world, by starting from the knowledge field, right, and then coming back to talking about the field of knowledge that we can have. So that will be probably another alternative way of looking at how we perceive the world. Of course, this is the relation between knowledge and practice. And I don't want to create another version of two separate culture here, but probably we can consider knowledge and practice as something together enculturate each other. Okay, so that is my first point. The second point is about the relation between wording and worlding. Okay, so I think of course many scholars has already made it clear that there are sort of important linkage between these two regimes, wording and worlding, in different dimension. When our wording, allow us to explain the world, and also it limit our capability to explain the world as well, and vice versa, wording also coming back and then form up our way of explaining things as well. So both wording and wording is sort of a reflexive, performative, agency between each other, But then I would like to focus on the idea of wording. So when we put words together, to explain the world, it become narratives, right? So narrative is something that we use to explain our living and our relation to the world. But narrative can be, on one hand, again, like fictitious, something based on fiction, and also some kind of narrative tend to be more factual, so it become more like a concrete or solid knowledge. But then in reality, in practice, the distinction between the fictitious and factual statement are very blurred, or to use, Stratton idea is become more sort of fraction, so or in your own term, it is a kind of mixed temporality. So I think if we are going to think across world, we also need to think across words as well, especially, in relation to the field that we are coming from. For example, the word of humanities, or the idea of culture, or idea of ecology, or even literature. For example, um, um, in Thailand, there is a case that people living in the forest are being expelled. The ethnic group, they're not allowed to live in the forest, and they are forced to move away from the area that they used to live for a long time. And this is the idea of ecology that has been imposed by those technocrats and also in the government sector, right? So what I'm trying to say is that some words tend to be more or become more rigidly defined, more than other words. So there are politics here in terms of wording. So my question is that how can we deal with such rigidity of wording? Because of course we would like to unpack, we would like to problematize the way we use the term. But what does it mean? We, of course, in academic, we are now talking about trying to unbox, or make critique about how we use the term, different term, and different term mean different things to different people. But then it is there is something going on, within the way we use the term as well. Some terms are more rigidly defined, as I mentioned. I'm talking about technical term. So my question is, how can we deal with such rigidity in order to create, for example, what you say, mutual constructive complication? Is that possible to everyone, or is it applied only to certain group of people?
Go ahead, Casper. I think Casper's.
I'll have to my all seriousness. I think you did say, made a series of quite complicated points, and I'll see how much I can get back to. And I think the first one was about this kind of right. I think if I heard you correctly, you're saying something along the lines of, rather than inhabiting separate disciplines, this was before you exploded it as a matter of whether it's about schooling and university disciplines and so on, rather than inhabiting different disciplines characterized by their own distinctive knowledges, which I may have sort of gestured at. In fact, each of those disciplines are themselves constituted to a significant degree by borrowing, which means that the other, if you will, the other is already on the inside of where we are at. And so what are the implications of that situation. I think this is really, I mean, I think this is the situation, and in fact not radically, not very much at odds from what I was trying to convey with the, I mean, the fractal imagery I was trying to produce through the talk, whether it succeeded or not, right, was starting with two columns. Okay, they look nice, but I'm also over here in terms of what I study, and you'll say I'm also over here in terms of the aims of what I study. And then the next one, this presumably cultural topic here is actually also over here. And in fact, both are over here and both are over here, right? That's the fractal figure. So it's starting, the way it operates is starting from the presumption of a whole thing and then chopping it into little pieces. And I think getting at it from the Latour, like when you're saying borrowing, I hear translation also, right? And therefore I hear the Latourian imagery of hybridity. That is, I think, another way of talking about the same kind of situation. Right? It's because in a certain sense that there's nothing that constitutionally belongs to you exclusively, that everybody is continuously in a process where they need to borrow, steal, or tweak from everybody else in order to create the kinds of tools they need for themselves, because what they have right now anymore. And so I think that is where it, but then that replicates in different constellations all the time, right? Also for creation of new hierarchies. For example, in literary scholarship, I think there was years ago this, deep analysis for so long, so on. But now we will borrow or steal from information technology in such a manner that we can make enormous data sets, and therefore we can be more scientific and defeat all those sort of in-depth analysis of Shakespeare that was, after all, only using the instrument of the scholar himself, right? So we're going to defeat that by drowning it in data and finding patterns in data sets, right? So it's brought in, and then it's made to do a kind of work there that is not necessarily a sophisticated conjunction, but can also be sort of a weapon of war, right? Conversely, in anthropology, field work is often used to defeat people who make claims on behalf of biological anthropology and so on, right? Conversely, others in evolutionary psychology will say, well, field work, it's only you being subjective. So all of this, for each set of relation, you can always make this kind of double move of either trying to turn it into something has the potential for, what should we say, an information enrichment of the environment, or you can turn it into a sort of warhammer for smashing some people around you that you don't like and reestablish a particular kind of hierarchy. And this is, I think, unavoidable. And you can't do, so I wouldn't say it's unavoidable that the possibility is there, because there's nobody that says that you'll do great just because you say you want to make sophisticated conjunctions. Everybody wants to get along and do it. Nobody can say that that will happen. Like it is in the word of Stengers and others, it's an event that is, it's a sort of unique, if it happens, it's something distinctive and unique that will have happened. It's not a method, you can say, right? We do this and therefore everything will be great. But I wouldn't say that it's something that belongs to anybody in particular, right? I mean, it's everybody can in principle say on the right on my screen here, I'm going to be enriched in some sense because she knows stuff about Japanese robotics, or I can steal her stuff and turn it into mine without getting enriched in any particular way, right? I mean, it's up to us in each of the situations, something travel between us in such a way that it becomes a different thing. But it's not any status, right? You can just, I think at a personal level, or sort of personal disposition, I think this is a more interesting and appealing version of coexisting in an ecology of knowledges. And then on a far from personal level, I think that something like that is required if we're going to have any possibility for developing rich, varied, and adequate, in some sense, responses to the more or less enormous mess we find ourselves in. But I don't think it gives a method or a guarantee for it. I think it provides an opening that people can step into if they like. Now, just a quick one. I mean, because you address field work, and that's of course talk about that, but not necessarily people who do field work here. So it's also necessary to say that field work is a distinctive thing that anthropologists in particular love to do, and some STSs love to do, and microsociologists. But what is field work? I mean, it's not set in the nature of things that field work is spending 8 years in the field, right? First, it changed within anthropology, so you could do it at home, you can do it multi-sided and so on. And if you're going to just sort of push it a little bit, you might want to say that, well, the field, does that have to be people that are alive? What about an archive? Couldn't that be in field? Then what about then YouTube? Couldn't that? Are we so sure about what it is we get from insisting on a particular version of field? Or the reason why I want to say these things is like, because if you begin spreading it out, then you get the same kind of fractal movement again, like, could this also then not be a field? Like, and you'd end up with something where the patterns can change. And the best example I have of that, I'm still not sure what it means, but it always stuck with me enormously. When Alfred Gell, as you know, but a very famous anthropologist in his own right, an anthropologist of art, in fact, when he introduced his own work shortly before he died, pretty young, of cancer, among many other chapters of studies done in India and I think in Melanesia, there was also his study of Marilyn Strathern, who was his colleague, he had enormously great difficulties understanding. And he wrote in the introduction, where he was trying to explain what he was doing, that this is probably the hardest intellectual labor I've ever done. This was his colleague next door, right? I think of this as doing field work, but field work on a text. So what he was saying was like, I'm trying to activate my sort of anthropological imaginary and do the same techniques of estrangement. Like, I absolutely have no idea what these guys are up to, what their kinship systems are like, or their love lives, or whatever. I'll have to use the same kinds of things in order to understand my colleagues from 2 doors down, because I have not the least idea what it is she's trying to convey in her mystical books. Yeah. So I think this field work on a text is very striking to me as a metaphor, because it suggests that the text, in this case, an anthropological theory text, is an empirical artifact on the same level as a found pot or something else. But conversely, of course, it also then suggests that the pot or the YouTube or whatever is a conceptual vessel just as much as the anthropological theory. And then I think we're at a really, really interesting point in terms of thinking about fractal knowledges and an ecology of practices, which is also one you reach at, because you're saying, do we need to insist that it's just university academic knowledges that define the whole field? And the answer, once you realize that everything can be a conceptual, empirical thing for inquiry, is that no, of course not. Like, you can get potentially our conceptual resources for dealing with climate change are not found in humanities or social humanities texts, or even in conventional literature, or even in science fiction. Maybe they're found among Indian potters who have found something to do, right? You see, so the point is that you keep pushing it in this direction, the fractalization, then you'll end with an infinite set of possible patterns you can build up, which is not just my idea, I think, but Strathern's idea via partial connections, Stenger's idea via an ecology of practice, and of course also Donna Haraway's with a game of cat's cradle, which conveys the same sense of sort of moving things between to try to weave a pattern together and you don't know what the pattern is going to be, but you're going to know if it breaks, because it falls then, right? We don't know where we're headed, but I think this is a very, so this cuts across the whole social fabric, in my opinion, if you like. And you'll also notice that it has totally dispensed with any hierarchy, right? I mean, it's not saying that Strathern wins in the end of the day, or I've defined what a sophisticated conjunction is. I don't know what it is. I'm just saying, I think it's something to try to figure out, to pursue, rather than something else. And this is why I keep using these conversational or sort of collaborative metaphors. Collectively, we'll have to sort of figure this out collectively across differences, and maybe with differences as motivating it, given simply because regardless of our enormous differences, we're so far at least similar in inhabiting the same limited little thing in space, right? Which is, when I talk climate change, is what we're talking about here. I mean, you can't figure out to deal, and there won't be differences left to have, right? So, but for that, resources must be mobilized, and everybody must, in principle, be involved in that.
Okay, thank you, Casper. I think thanks to everyone for your questions and answers as well. But I think we're running out of time. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and Casper and Dr. Chakrit as well. But we'll continue our conversation in the email after this post as well. And also, if Casper happens to be able to travel, we might see him again in Thailand and Chiang Mai, and everyone who might join us virtually, I guess, you know, is this mixed hybridities, I guess, hybridization of the knowledge. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. So I'll stay here until everyone's leaves the room, and then I'll close the room after that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.